Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on external subsidies. What is an external subsidy? Well, if you think of sanctions as the stick, external subsidies are the carrot. So a sanction is a punishment for you taking a non-cooperative action, whereas an external subsidy is a reward for taking a cooperative action. For example, I will give you money if and only if you don't start a civil war within your country. I am trying to pay you to convince you to enjoy peace. Why would I be willing to do that? After all, if I'm making this payment, it's costly to me. Why would I be willing to bear that sort of cost? Well, the answer is negative externalities. Wars create negative externalities. Those are losses in utilities for states that are not involved in a conflict. So you can think about a civil war that's going on in one country and another country that's sitting next to that war. Well, that country that's sitting next to the country involved in the Civil War is actually going to be paying some sort of burden as a result of that conflict. Think about Pakistan in the United States-Afghanistan war. So when the United States invades Afghanistan, we see militants flowing across the border from Afghanistan into Pakistan. That is a cost that Pakistan is having to pay because of this war between the United States and Afghanistan. Similarly, think about what's going on with the civil war in Syria right now. There is a humanitarian crisis. There is a large number of refugees flowing from Syria out of the country, understandably, into relatively safer places. But these other countries that are accepting these refugee flows, perhaps unwillingly, are having to pay a cost to make sure that there is no lawlessness as a result of these refugee flows. So this is a cost that those countries are having to bear as a result of the civil war in Syria causing a refugee crisis. In addition to this, civil wars cause spillovers. So if we look at two states that are not involved in a civil war, there is a 2.1% chance of those states getting themselves into a militarized interstate dispute each year. A militarized interstate dispute, or a MID, is a militarized conflict that doesn't necessarily go all the way up to a war. So this could be a couple of ambassadors yelling at each other, which results in militaries from both sides mobilizing to the border, but no one ever actually shooting each other. These are tensions and things that you would want to avoid because they could erupt into a conflict, and generally bad things for you. You don't want to have militarized interstate disputes between your country and another country. And you're doing a pretty good job when you're not involved in a civil war at any given time. But if you look at two states with at least one of those states involved in a civil war, suddenly your chances of having a militarized interstate dispute are jumping. So with one of those states involved in a civil war, instead of having a 2.1% chance of a MID, you're having a 4.3% chance of a MID. You're essentially doubling the likelihood that you're going to get yourself involved in a militarized interstate dispute because there's one of those countries involved in a civil war. So civil wars are bad for you, even if you're not in the country that has the civil war going on. So because war is costly for you, even if you're not a participant, you might be willing to pay a little to support the peace than actually having to pay a whole lot more because of a war that's going on. Again, even though you're not involved in that conflict. So we at least have the justification for why you would be willing to pay an external subsidy. The remaining question is, why would an external subsidy be effective? Well, we actually have a good answer to that, and we can go back to our model of the risk-return trade-off with bargaining with incomplete information for a good answer. So remember that when you have incomplete information, war occurs with positive probability if Q, that's the probability that the rebel group is weak, is greater than that critical value on the right side of the inequality. It's the sum of costs of war divided by the difference in possibility of power for the rebel group plus the rebel group's cost. Think about how external subsidies affect this calculation. If you're in a world where external subsidies aren't possible, these costs only reflect the military costs of conflict. These are paying for tanks, having people die, having your buildings be exploded, that sort of stuff. That's what those costs represent. But in a world where external subsidies are possible, when you're going to war, not only are you paying those militarized costs, you're also foregoing whatever the subsidy was. If the subsidy was $1 billion, not only are you paying the cost of conflict, but you're also not receiving the $1 billion that you would have received had you maintained the peace. So the effect of an external subsidy is to increase the cost of war. And notice that if you take the costs of war and you make them arbitrarily large, say like close to infinity, then that right side of the inequality is going to go to infinity as well. That's because you're taking the costs of conflict in the numerator and you're making it arbitrarily large. And if you're making it arbitrarily large like that, then it's impossible for a value q, which is a probability between 0 and 1, to be greater than a number that's close to infinity. It's going to be assuredly true that q is not greater than that, and when that's true, you're not going to have war. So external subsidies are effective in terms of raising costs of conflict and lowering the probability or lowering your desire to go to war. So if you're making war more costly, then if war is more costly, information and commitment problems are less likely to trigger. And if information problems and commitment problems are less likely to trigger, you're less likely to end up in war. So that's how an external subsidy can help out. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope to see you next time. Take care.